All right, let's dive deep into shadow work today. We're going way beyond just surface level stuff, uncovering the real power behind this whole transformative process, using your shadow work journal and workbook along the way.
Yeah, a lot of people, when they hear shadow work, they think it's all doom and gloom, dwelling on negativity. But it's really about bringing those hidden parts of ourselves
Mhm.
out into the open so we can really integrate them and become more whole.
Exactly. Like finally meeting those demons we've been carrying around all this time, realizing they're not as scary as we thought. But first, maybe we should clarify what we mean by this whole shadow self thing.
Well, you can think of it like this. Our conscious mind, it's like the tip of the iceberg. And the shadow, that's down in the depths below, formed by experiences a lot of times from childhood that we've pushed down or just disowned completely.
The workbook uses a similar analogy, comparing the shadow to kind of the negative aspects of our personality that come from, well, past trauma or emotions we just weren't ready to handle at the time.
And this is why it's so important. Those unaddressed parts of us, they can really influence how we react to things,
Mhm.
often in ways that, sabotage our relationships or careers or even just our personal growth. Have you ever noticed yourself like overreacting to a situation, way out of proportion to what was actually happening, maybe?
Oh, totally relatable. The workbook talks about how we create coping mechanisms that seem helpful on the surface, but are actually rooted in our shadow. Say someone who learned to just bottle up their sadness as a kid, they might turn to like overeating as an adult to numb those emotions.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how the shadow can show up through these unhealthy behaviors. And shadow work, it helps us see these patterns and make a conscious decision to respond differently.
So, how does shadow work actually help us gain that control and that awareness? The workbook mentions some pretty compelling benefits.
Well, for one thing, it helps us understand those deep-seated motivations behind why we do the things we do. It's like finally seeing the puppet master behind the scenes, so we can actually see the strings and take control.
The workbook talks about how shadow work can drastically improve relationships, careers, and just overall well being.
It all boils down to self-awareness. The more we understand our shadow, the more we can make choices that are in line with our values, instead of being controlled by these unconscious impulses.
And this isn't about beating ourselves up for having a shadow, right? It's more about integrating it and accepting it.
Absolutely. It's not about pushing those parts of ourselves away. It's about acknowledging them and understanding them. The workbook uses this powerful image of hugging your shadow, almost like it's a scared child who needs reassurance and love. I know it sounds a little strange, but the idea is to create space for those emotions, to be acknowledged and healed.
Yeah, that really resonated with me too, shifting from fighting against our shadow to embracing it with compassion.
And that compassion extends to ourselves. Shadow work involves a lot of self-forgiveness. It's realizing that those negative traits, they often came about as coping mechanisms, especially during childhood.
So it's about understanding that younger version of ourselves and why they built up those defenses. Speaking of understanding, how do we actually shed light on our shadow? The workbook suggests a few methods, and some are a little unconventional.
This is where it gets interesting. The workbook dives into techniques that use visualization and intention. For example, there's the rose tool visualization, where you imagine surrounding your shadow with a red rose to neutralize difficult emotions.
That's like a way to bring peace and grounding to what could be a really intense process. What's the reasoning behind using that kind of imagery?
Well, the red rose, it symbolizes love and compassion. So by picturing it around our shadow, we're essentially sending that energy to the parts of ourselves that need it most. It's a way to shift that internal dialogue from fear and judgment to acceptance and understanding.
The workbook also mentions that these techniques, while unconventional, can have a big impact on our energy, almost like clearing out energetic blockages.
Right. A lot of traditions believe that unprocessed emotions and experiences, they can create stagnation in our energy field, leading to all sorts of imbalances. And these visualization techniques are designed to help release those blockages and bring back a sense of flow.
Okay, so we've talked about what shadow work is and why it's important, and we've got some tools for uncovering it. But how do we actually dive into this process? The workbook really emphasizes journal prompts as a key to unlocking those hidden parts of our minds.
Journaling can be so powerful because it gives us this safe space to explore our inner world without judgment. The workbook has some really thought-provoking questions designed to help us get to the root of our shadow and see the patterns in how we behave.
For example, there's one prompt that asks, "What are you most afraid of?"
Mhm.
Seems simple, but it makes you think about the why behind our fears. What does that fear say about our shadow?
Exactly. It's not just about naming the fear. It's about figuring out where it came from and how it might be holding us back. Another one that stood out to me asks, what are your biggest regrets? Again, it's about digging deeper, understanding what those regrets tell us about our values, our fears, our shadow.
Okay. It's like uncovering those hidden beliefs and patterns that might be unconsciously driving us. But all this self-exploration can feel pretty daunting. What does the workbook suggest for tackling these prompts?
It really stresses honesty and self-compassion. Remember, this is about discovering ourselves, not judging ourselves. We're not here to punish ourselves for past mistakes or negative traits. We're just trying to understand them so we can move forward with more awareness and freedom.
It's like being as kind and curious with ourselves as we would be with a friend. And speaking of kindness, the workbook talks about inner child work as a really crucial part of shadow work. What exactly does that mean?
Well, we've talked about how the shadow often develops in childhood. It's shaped by experiences that shape our beliefs and how we cope. Inner child work is about addressing those wounds and the needs that weren't met back then, recognizing that those early experiences, especially the negative ones, they still affect us as adults.
Like going back and offering that younger version of ourselves, the love and validation and support they might not have had.
Exactly. And it's about understanding how our parents' own experiences, their own shadows, might have influenced how they treated us. It's not about blaming them, but about seeing the bigger picture of how these patterns can be passed down through generations.
The workbook mentions inner child affirmations as a way to rewrite those negative beliefs we might have from childhood, like, I am safe now, or it's not my fault.
Yeah, those affirmations can be so helpful for building that sense of self-love and safety. It's like planting seeds of positivity in our subconscious.
Mhm.
And by taking care of those seeds, we can create a more loving inner world.
It's about rewriting those old limiting beliefs and replacing them with ones that empower us to live more authentically and joyfully.
That's where self-care comes in. It's really crucial in shadow work. It can be emotionally intense. So, you need to be gentle with yourself and give yourself space to process everything.
The workbook mentions a bunch of different practices to help with that. Things like meditation, spending time outdoors, being creative. Are there any specific practices that work well for you in your own routine?
For sure. For me, spending time in nature, it's so grounding and restorative. It lets me connect to something bigger than myself
Hmm.
and release any pent-up energy or emotions.
Yeah.
How about you? Anything in the workbook stand out to you?
I've been trying journaling lately, and it's been surprisingly helpful for sorting out those complicated emotions that come up during shadow work. It's like I'm having a conversation with myself on paper, and it clears my head. The workbook also talks about a technique for processing past experiences. That I found really interesting, using pros and cons lists.
Pros and cons lists. That sounds almost too simple. How does that sit in with shadow work?
It's about shifting our perspective from victimhood to empowerment, instead of just focusing on the pain from something in the past, like a relationship or an event. We can use these lists to analyze what we learned from those experiences. It's about finding the wisdom in those challenges.
Ah, I get it. So by looking at the pros, even in difficult situations, we can start to take back our power and see how those experiences, even though they were tough, ultimately helped us grow.
Exactly. The workbook specifically mentions using this for past relationships that might still be causing pain.
Yeah.
By understanding the lessons we learned, we can start to let go of that emotional baggage and move forward with a better understanding and more peace.
It's a way to reframe those experiences
Hmm.
and see them as opportunities for growth instead of setbacks. The workbook even talks about applying this to our childhoods.
That makes sense. A lot of our shadow comes from those early experiences. By looking closely at our relationships with our parents or caregivers, we can start to see how their own shadows might have affected their behavior, and how those patterns might still be influencing us as adults.
It's not about blaming them. It's about gaining a deeper understanding of the dynamics that shaped us. It can be a powerful step in breaking free from negative patterns and creating healthier relationships in our lives.
I know shadow work can seem intimidating, and some people might wonder if it's okay to do it on their own. What kind of guidance does the workbook give on that?
It really stresses self-awareness and honoring your limits. If you're dealing with past trauma or any mental health issues, it's always a good idea to seek professional help from a therapist. They can provide a safe and supported environment to explore those deeper wounds.
It's like having a guide to help you through the rougher parts. The workbook also acknowledges that shadow work is a journey, not a destination. It's about growing at your own pace and taking breaks when you need them.
Self-compassion is so important. We need to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding. that we extend to our shadow self.
It's a reminder that healing takes time, and it's okay to move at our own speed. The workbook doesn't sugarcoat the fact that this process can be tough. It can bring up some uncomfortable emotions, but it also highlights the potential for real liberation and growth.
It's like cleaning out a really cluttered attic. It's dusty and overwhelming at first, but once you get rid of all that old, stagnant energy, you create space for something new and beautiful.
I love that analogy. And speaking of clearing out old energy, the workbook includes some really interesting techniques for shadow work that go beyond just journaling.
Yeah, this is where things get a little more mystical and energetic. The workbook calls them little-known shadow work hacks from the teachers of light.
I have to admit, when I first read that, I was skeptical. It sounds like something out of a fantasy book.
It does have a mystical feel to it.
Yeah.
But remember, we're talking about the subconscious mind, where logic and reason often take a backseat to intuition and imagination.
Right. The workbook emphasizes that these techniques work on an energetic level, using visualization and intention to clear blockages.
The idea is that our energy bodies hold on to a lot of unprocessed emotions and experiences, and these techniques help us release that stagnant energy and bring back a sense of flow and vitality.
One technique that really stood out to me, and I'll admit made me laugh a little, is called Rainbow Bright's Tube of Healing. I mean, the name itself sounds whimsical, but the concept is actually pretty interesting.
It's definitely a unique approach. The workbook tells us to lie down, close our eyes, and picture a bright rainbow surrounding our body in a tube of light.
It's about using the power of color and light to cleanse and energize our aura, our energy field.
Exactly. And remember, it's about feeling it, not overthinking it. The workbook encourages us to approach these techniques with playfulness and curiosity.
It's about tapping into our inner child and allowing ourselves to experiment with different ways of healing. Now, the workbook also mentions a technique that's a little more esoteric.
This one involves drinking water. That's been charged with something called the cosmic diamond violet flame.
Okay, the cosmic diamond violet flame. Now we're getting into some serious new age territory. I'm curious to learn more about this.
It's actually a concept you can find in a lot of different spiritual traditions. The violet flame is said to have transformative properties. It can change negative energy into positive energy.
So how do we charge water with this mystical flame? Do we need to build a bonfire or something?
No bonfires needed. The workbook describes a simple process. You take a glass of clean water, filtered or spring water is best, and ask with reverence for the cosmic diamond violet flame to enter the water.
So we're essentially asking for this higher energy to infuse the water with its healing power.
Exactly. Intention is key here. We're aligning our energy with this transformative force and inviting it to work through us. The workbook even suggests asking certain ascended masters and archangels to help with the process, like Saint Germain, Zadkiel, and Gabriel.
So once we've asked, do we just drink the water?
Not quite yet. The workbook tells us to close our eyes and visualize a bright violet diamond surrounding the glass of water to amplify our intention.
It's like we're creating this powerful energy vortex around the water. And then we express gratitude to those who are helping us with this.
Exactly. Gratitude is a powerful amplifier of energy. It completes the circle and acknowledges that everything is connected. Now, whether or not you connect with the mystical side of these techniques, the main takeaway is that they use the power of our imagination and intention.
They offer a different way of thinking about healing, and it's up to each person to decide if they resonate with them. Now, the workbook also suggests paying attention to our dreams after trying these techniques.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we might get insights or messages from our subconscious through our dreams.
Exactly. It's like opening a channel to our inner wisdom. And that leads us to the core of the workbook, the deep dive into journal prompts.
These prompts are like keys that unlock those hidden parts of our subconscious. They help us dig up those shadow aspects and understand the patterns that are driving our behavior.
A lot of the prompts focus on childhood experiences, which makes sense considering how much of our shadow develops during those years. For example, there's one that asks, when did you feel most vulnerable as a child?
That's a really powerful question. It encourages us to explore those early wounds. That might still be affecting our sense of safety and self-worth as adults.
Another prompt that caught my eye is, what is your biggest regret? Again, it's about going beyond just identifying the regret and really understanding the why. What does that regret tell us about our values, our fears, our shadow?
Exactly. These prompts are like flashlights, shining a light on those dark corners of our psyche and helping us to see ourselves more fully.
I know diving into this level of self-exploration can be intimidating for some people. It can be scary to face those hidden parts of ourselves. What advice does the workbook give for approaching these prompts with courage and compassion?
It emphasizes honesty and self-compassion. It reminds us that we're not trying to punish ourselves for past mistakes or negative traits. We're simply trying to understand them so we can move forward with greater awareness and freedom.
It's about being kind to ourselves and realizing that we're all works in progress. We're not aiming for perfection, but for wholeness.
And remember, this is a journey, not a race. You can take your time, explore your own pace, and come back to these prompts whenever you need to.
Before we wrap up our exploration of shadow work, I want to touch on one more concept from the workbook: shadow and light integration.
Shadow and light integration. That sounds like we're combining opposites.
In a way, we are. The workbook suggests that by embracing our shadow, by acknowledging those parts of ourselves that we don't like, we actually make it possible for our light to shine even brighter.
It's like saying that by accepting our flaws, our imperfections, we become more whole, more authentic, and ultimately more capable of expressing our true potential.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we are both light and shadow. We're complex beings with a full range of emotions, experiences, and qualities, and it's by embracing that wholeness that we truly come alive.
This reminds me of Carl Jung, the psychologist who really made the shadow concept popular. He believed that the shadow isn't something to be afraid of or try to get rid of, but actually a source of creativity and power.
That's such an empowering perspective. Instead of seeing our shadow as a weakness, we can see it as an asset, a source of strength.
It's about integrating those shadow qualities into our personalities in a healthy way. For instance, someone who tends to be overly critical of themselves might use that shadow quality to develop a keen eye for detail, maybe becoming a successful editor or art critic.
It's about recognizing the potential within those shadow aspects
Yeah.
and finding ways to channel them in a positive way.
And this process of shadow and light integration is ongoing. It's not about reaching some endpoint of perfection. It's about embracing the journey of growth and self-discovery.
It's about becoming more comfortable with the messiness of being human, the light and the dark, and realizing that's where our true beauty lies.
Beautifully said. And I love how the workbook emphasizes that this journey is deeply personal. You don't have to follow anyone else's timeline or share your shadow work with anyone else.
It's about respecting our own process and our own boundaries.
The workbook acknowledges that this can be challenging work. It can be scary, draining, and even overwhelming sometimes.
But it also highlights the incredible rewards that come from doing this work. It can be so freeing and empowering to face those hidden parts of ourselves and reclaim our wholeness.
It's about stepping into our authenticity, shadows and all.
And speaking of bringing those shadows into the light, the workbook offers a final, thought-provoking suggestion: creating a shadow altar.
A shadow altar. That sounds intriguing. What exactly does that involve?
It's like we're giving our shadow a physical space, a place to exist.
Exactly. And the workbook doesn't give any hard and fast rules for making one. It's all about using our intuition and getting creative to design a space that really speaks to us.
We could include things that represent those shadow qualities we're working on. Maybe crystals for healing, or candles to bring light to things.
Exactly. And we can use it for meditation or journaling, or just as a reminder that we're committed to embracing our whole selves.
I really like that. It's a physical, tangible way to honor the work we're doing on ourselves. Now, this might sound a little out there, but remember, shadow work is all about going beyond the ordinary. It's about exploring those deep parts of ourselves and discovering those hidden gems.
It's about embracing the unknown and trusting that, even if these techniques sound a little unusual, they can have a powerful effect on our energy and subconscious.
And speaking of powerful effects, the workbook suggests that creating a shadow altar can be a really strong way to face those parts of ourselves that we tend to avoid or push down.
It's like saying, hey, shadow, I see you, I acknowledge you, you have a place here, but you don't get to call the shots.
The workbook even suggests putting things on the altar that trigger us, things that bring up those difficult emotions we're trying to work through. It seems counterintuitive, but I can see how facing those triggers in a safe environment could be a powerful way to confront them.
It's about reclaiming our power from those triggers and integrating them into our whole being.
Exactly. And by facing them head on, we can start to break free from their grip.
Now, some people might be wondering if shadow work is safe to do alone. After all, we're dealing with some pretty heavy emotional stuff. What does the workbook have to say about that?
It emphasizes being self-aware and knowing your limits. If you're dealing with past trauma or mental health challenges, it's always a good idea to talk to a professional.
Absolutely. A therapist can provide a safe and supportive environment to help you work through those deeper wounds and develop healthy coping mechanisms.
It's like having a knowledgeable guide for the tougher parts of the journey. The workbook also reminds us that shadow work isn't a quick fix, it's a process, and it's okay to take breaks.
Self-care is so important. Be gentle with yourself and go at your own pace.
So true. To wrap up our deep dive into shadow work, I want to leave you with one last empowering thought from the workbook. It says, the shadow isn't something to be feared or eliminated. It's a part of us that's been waiting to be seen, understood, and loved.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. It's not something to be afraid of or reject, but a part of us that holds the potential for growth and transformation.
By embracing our shadow, we open ourselves up to being more authentic, more whole, and ultimately living a more fulfilling life. We become more compassionate, understanding, and accepting of ourselves and others.
And that's a gift that spreads outward, creating a more loving and accepting world for everyone.
So as you continue exploring shadow work, remember to be kind to yourself, be curious, and be willing to embrace every part of who you are. And remember, you're not alone on this journey.
There are so many others out there exploring too, discovering those hidden treasures within.
Until next time, keep diving deep.